if we can make conventional fuels also carbon neutral, then they should also be given an exemption to be used as well. You're right, guys. In this video, we're going to cover the biggest problems with e-fuels, with synthetic fuels. So a bit of background: new cars with internal combustion engines, in the EU at least, will be banned from 2035. If the car will run exclusively on e-fuel or a synthetic fuel, then that car with that engine, with that internal combustion engine, will still be allowed to be sold after 2035. Why do they get an exemption? They get an exemption because the process is supposed to be CO2 neutral. The CO2 that's released from the fuel being burnt in an engine was originally sequestered from the atmosphere by the manufacturing process of the e-fuel, of the synthetic fuel. So that's what's going to happen with the exemptions, and that's the reason why. What I want to answer in this video is, if we look at the biggest problems with e-fuels and synthetic fuels, does the exemption make any sense? Should it happen? So the biggest problems. So the first problem is that e-fuels, synthetic fuels, they were not designed to be environmentally friendly. This was not on the agenda when people came up with the idea of e-fuels. E-fuels were an alternative to oil if for some reason the supply of oil was ever cut off, terminated. It was to give a way to give countries energy independence. So for example, in the 70s, when there was political problems in the Middle East, the supply of oil was questionable, the price could have gone through the roof. During the Second World War, countries were frightened that they would lose their ability to get access to Arabian oil, so they wanted an alternative. So that is the reason e-fuels, synthetic fuels exist, and it was nothing to do with being an environmentally friendly fuel. Second biggest problem with e-fuels is the amount of energy it takes to make them. From sources I've seen, put a link in the video description, and a link to this article also in the video description, it takes around 27 kilowatt hours of energy to make 9 kilowatt hours of fuel, which is a lot of energy. It's energy negative by a long way. In other words, there's going to have to be a lot of solar farms and or wind farms built to power the process. Number three, this is, someone left a comment on the last video I did on synthetic fuels, and they said it gives us energy independence, which is not really true. I mean, it is true if you're going to be taking oil out of the ground and turning that into petroleum and diesel. But for the e-fuels that Porsche's talking about, taking it out of the atmosphere, the production of e-fuels needs to take place in places which are either extremely windy and or extremely sunny. The sunny parts are obviously going to be deserts, which generally speaking is where a lot of the oil comes from today. With regards to constant extreme wind, they're looking at sort of the southern tip of South America. In short, it doesn't give energy security or energy independence to European countries, at least. Number 4 on the list, because of the energy involved, the amount of power it needs to make e-fuels, it's not really going to be capable of replacing oil. It's not a like-for-like replacement. The chemicals that it needs for the processes, the power it needs, I think it makes it very unlikely that it could ever be an alternative to oil. Number 5 on the list is e-fuels, synthetic fuels are going to be more expensive than oil-based fuels and probably cost quite a lot more for all the reasons I've just mentioned. But the main thing being the energy requirements is going to cost a lot of money to create that much energy, whether it's building and maintaining wind farms, massive wind farms, or building and maintaining massive solar farms. And then you've got the process itself of making it on such a massive scale is also going to cost money. So it's more expensive. How much more expensive, I don't know, but it's never going to be as cheap as oil-based fuels. And anything that makes transport more expensive is going to make everything more expensive. Number 6, the emissions from e-fuels, from synthetic fuels, is exactly the same as the emissions from oil-based fuels. So there's absolutely no gain in that respect with regards to what you're getting out of the tailpipe. It doesn't help. E-fuels, synthetic fuels, do absolutely nothing to help the problem of vehicle emissions in populated areas. In the countryside, okay, no problem, the plants love it, but in the towns is where the people are living, and the synthetic fuels, e-fuels, are not going to be a solution for emissions in towns. And then we come on to number 7, and this is by far the biggest, hugest problem with e-fuels. There are better, cheaper, and much more obvious ways of getting CO2 from the atmosphere. For example, if the goal is solely to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, we could just plant crops, for example, hemp. Well, the added benefit of that is that we can sell the hemp after, so it's actually a profitable exercise to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere with hemp, rather than a process that costs an absolute ton of money. Going back to what I said earlier, the only reason that e-fuels and synthetic fuels make sense is if we're living in an environment where oil doesn't exist for whatever reason, our supply is being cut off or it's just run out. That is the only time it makes sense to be creating a fuel from the CO2 in the atmosphere. While there's oil available in plentiful supplies, it's much cheaper, more straightforward, and probably more environmentally friendly, or in fact I'm almost sure it's more environmentally friendly to simply burn the oil that's in the ground and sequester that CO2 from the atmosphere by growing crops which can be used for other things, whether it be making fabrics, making building materials, making paper, making food. There's many better ways of sequestering CO2 that actually makes money rather than costing money. And this again is the biggest problem with e-fuels, and for me at least makes it a complete ridiculous concept, for lack of a better word. So if we look at all those things together, all those problems I just highlighted, does the exemption for internal combustion engines that run exclusively on synthetic fuel still make sense? Well, I would say sure. If you've got the money to buy the synthetic fuel, because it's not going to be cheap, then sure. But on the other hand, I don't think the method of the manufacture of the e-fuel should be the issue. If the issue is to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, then any fuel that is carbon neutral should be allowed to be sold, allowed to be burned. And there is quite a simple way to have a CO2 neutral fuel. As I said, it all comes down to planting crops. So as long as someone can show that they're offsetting their CO2 emissions by growing something or buying credits from firms that will do the farming for them, for example, or maybe even Shell and BP could start offsetting the emissions from the fuels that they sell, then there's no reason why any fuel should not be granted an exemption. I mean, this is the only reason that the internal combustion engines are being banned, is because they're adding to the CO2 in the environment, if you believe that that is a negative thing. So in a nutshell, yes, it makes sense to grant an exemption to a fuel that is carbon neutral. No, it doesn't make sense to give that exemption to a specific fuel that's made in a certain way. If we can make conventional fuels also carbon neutral, then they should also be given an exemption to be used as well. Those are my thoughts. Love to know what you think. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, please subscribe, look after yourselves, and I'll see you again next time.